I remember the time when Witherhoard could insta-kill raid bosses. I mean, it was beyond funny, but it was stupidly broken. More broken than Telesto? Probably not. Anyway, Witherhoard has always been a pretty decent exotic weapon since it first came out, and despite certain nerfs to Witherhoard, and well, grenade launchers as a whole, it still doesn't break out of the best exotics in Destiny 2. Well, in this video, we're going to look at Witherhoard in 2022. Is it still effective in PvE or PvP? What are the pros and cons? And well, basically everything about Witherhoard. Now, it may be a good, well-balanced exotic, but is it actually worth using right now in 2022? Comment your answer down below, but before you keep watching and while you're commenting, I'll briefly let you know that this video has been sponsored by Awaya, so if you're after cheap silver with a cheeky discount, then be sure to visit the link below to find out more at their website. And now, without further delay, let's check out Witherhoard in 2022. So Witherhoard is a primary weapon. Well, actually, it's a kinetic weapon that uses special ammo, but it's in the primary slot. You get the point. But this weapon, honestly, tears through adds pretty quickly, and this thing is annoying as hell in PvP. The fact that it can cover the entire control point in Crucible just tells you everything. Now, the background gameplay in this video here is not going to be a Grandmaster Nightfall today, it's actually going to be a standard strike. That's not to tell you that you can't use it in GMs, because that's not the case. It's actually one of the best weapons to use in Nightfalls, but with the seasonal meta always changing due to seasonal mods, there are better options for doing certain things in the game. Now, before we move on, if you like these sort of videos and you want to see more, there is a full playlist link below that you may find useful, as I frequently make updated videos on all the content for new and returning players. So how do we get Witherhoard in 2022 for Season 15 and the upcoming Witch Queen? So to get Witherhoard as a Season of the Lost, you can buy it from the Exotic Archive at the tower. If you just head over to the kiosk, you'll find it under the Shadowkeep Exotics. This will cost you 1 Exotic Cipher, 100,000 Glimmer, 150 Planetary Materials, and 1 Ascendant Shard. Now, there are 2 cards on screen now showing you how to get Exotic Ciphers and Ascendant Shards in Destiny 2, up to date, and all of the best ways to get them fast. Feel free to check it out if you need to. Now, Witherhoard also has a catalyst, and to get the catalyst, you first have to purchase the weapon from the archive, and then head over to Gunsmith and you'll be given the catalyst quest. If you have any issues obtaining Witherhoard or its catalyst, leave a comment below and we'll find a solution to get you those as quick as we can if they are still available in the current season you're playing and, well, watching this video in. Now, briefly going over Witherhoard, it is a kinetic grenade launcher in the first slot that uses special ammo. The perks that Witherhoard have are Countermass, Black Powder, Break the Bank, where blighted targets take damage over time, and blight the nearby area on death. And then we also have a composite stock with its main exotic trait being Primeval's Torment. This reads, projectiles fired by the weapon blight the target or nearby area on impact. Now, you can treat this weapon like a special Anarchy for passive DPS, as you can leave those blights on a target or the ground near them while you swap to another weapon to deal your main damage. How the weapon essentially works is you fire your grenade from Witherhoard either on the enemy or on the ground, and then that enemy will take damage over time. Of course, if you blight the ground, then you'll want the target to remain in the circle, whereas if you fire it directly at the enemy, it will damage them regardless, as if they were being poisoned or burnt over time. You can also stack the damage by firing directly at them, as well as shooting the floor. Now, Witherhoard does have a catalyst, and if you have this equipped, then it will increase your handling, better for PvP, and holstering the weapon will automatically reload it after a short period of time, which really helps you improve that DPS when combining with other weapons. The best way to use Witherhoard effectively in PvE is to first fire a blight at the enemy, either directly or on the floor, then swap to your DPS weapon, ideally a sword, do a few swings and then swap back to Witherhoard, fire and repeat. If you have the catalyst, you'll be able to keep the Witherhoard damaging bosses simultaneously while using your heavy weapon, as you shouldn't ever need to reload Witherhoard itself, and by the time its first blight effect has ended, you would have already put down another one. Now, Witherhoard's damage isn't bad considering you can use it passively on the side among other weapons, and I'd strongly recommend using this weapon as a new or returning player because it's a good balanced weapon that works great in both PvE and PvP. The max ammo capacity for Witherhoard is 25 shots if using double grenade launcher reserve mods, which I'd recommend you do use at least one to really maximise that passive DPS, but as 25 rounds is quite a lot, you can spare another reserve mod for your heavy weapon instead. The base max ammo for Witherhoard is 21, then 23 with 1 reserve mod, and 25 with 2 of the mods slotted in. So how does Witherhoard perform in PvE, and where or what activities should we be using Witherhoard in? Well, this weapon is one of the best exotics as it's ranked NS tier, with an average rating for how difficult it is to use. It's essentially a mini Anarchy, and you really want to treat it like an Anarchy. Use it in places where you have tough adds, bosses, or even champions, whether that is your standard strike or your master or even Grandmaster Nightfalls. all. Raids and dungeons are also good places to use it in, but there's really no place you shouldn't use it. It's great in all PvE activities. However, most PvE players will use exotics based on current seasonal meta, so if there's a mod that makes an S tier exotic even better, such as the Season 15's Particle Deconstruction mod with 1000 voices, then you'll pair those two together and make something like an S tier plus, right? Because you have an S tier mod and an S tier exotic, then you just combine both together and you got an OP or broken combo. Just like how in Season 14 we had the Breach and Clear with Anarchy, and well, even this Witherhoard too, which is why it was one of the most used weapons during Season of the Splicer. Now that's all fine, but should we use it now, right now here in 2022, with or without the mods to make it better? The answer is yes. Just because currently we don't have good mods to pair it with doesn't mean it's a bad exotic, but having those mods will make it perform much better than it is. Although if you have mods like the Particle Deconstruction and 1K, then of course you're probably going to choose to use those over Witherhoard, which is fair, you should. Because it's all about DPS, right? And you want the best DPS in the game, so using that would be a better choice. But if you don't have those, then using Witherhoard is also a perfect alternative. So it's good to keep this weapon on standby ready to use when you either don't have other good exotics to use, or you just want to wait for another mod that will make grenade launchers better than they already are, again. Now in PvE, Witherhoard can be your best friend, much like Anarchy, because it can do passive DPS. If you really wanted to, you could just spam a boss with either Anarchy or Witherhoard and just hide in a corner. Use a special finisher to replenish the ammo quickly and then just repeat. It's probably the safest exotic to use when you're playing solo or wanting to do a solo flawless activity. On the other hand, it'll probably take you a while to complete the activity, but you won't need to go near bosses if you don't want to. Although, I actually suggest you do go up close because Witherhoard pairs great with swords, especially if you have the Catalyst. If I'm using Witherhoard, I'd simply have a Titan bubble or well, throw it down on the enemy's feet, throw down Witherhoard, and then deal damage with a sword, swapping back and forth with Witherhoard for passive DPS. That's how I'd use it in PvE anyway, and honestly it's the way you should use it. But overall for PvE, I definitely use it in there for all types of content. Now for PvP on the other hand, Witherhoard can be annoying as hell when played against, but awesome if you're using it. In PvP, you can hold down control points and force enemies to move away from where you don't want them to be, as you can just throw down a Witherhoard Blight on something like a control point or a doorway, which then forces the enemy to either back away or just sit there and die. Now my only issue with using Witherhoard in PvP is it takes away your kinetic slot, and I'd much rather use my kinetic primary weapons in PvP like my Judgment hand cannon or my pulse rifles. But it's not awful, as there are also a lot of good energy weapons for PvP as well. For me though, using Witherhoard in PvP isn't really the type of weapon I'd use, because I mean, if I wanted to stop an enemy from going somewhere, I'd simply just throw down a dust-filled stasis grenade and tell them to get moving or get frozen. But it's definitely a good option to use in PvP if you are a PvP player, or if you're a PvP player but you're not great at PvP, and you don't really have many other weapons unlocked in the game. Definitely pick up Witherhoard and give it a try in PvP, because honestly you might just enjoy it. Just don't pair it with double dust-filled grenades, because that just annoys everyone. But anyway, definitely a good weapon for PvP in my opinion. Now what about other exotic grenade launchers? How does Witherhoard compete against them, and should you choose to use Witherhoard over other exotics? Well, you have Anarchy, but that's a heavy, right? And then you have things like the Colony, Fighting Lion, Prospector, but honestly these grenade launchers aren't perfect. If anything, Anarchy is the only grenade launcher I'd choose to use, so let's compete against that. Anarchy in PvE is by far one of the best exotics despite its nerfs, because the amount of passive damage you can do over time is crazy. If you really wanted to, you could just sit there and kill a boss with minimal effort, so why don't we just use Anarchy and scrap Witherhoard? Well, put simply, you could, but Witherhoard is a special weapon, unlike Anarchy being a heavy, so you use other heavy weapons in its place and use Witherhoard instead as the passive DPS source like Anarchy would. It's pretty much the opposite, except Witherhoard is weaker than Anarchy because it's a special weapon. Now the other thing with these two weapons is that if you use an Anarchy, you'd probably go with legendary weapons that can deal damage from a range, whereas if you're using Witherhoard, you'd go with weapons that can deal damage at close range, and well, you wouldn't want to use Witherhoard at a range. You can, but I wouldn't, because its Catalyst pairs great with swords for switching between them and just firing at the floor. With Anarchy you can do the same thing, except you have to reload Anarchy unless you use up a mod slot or certain perks and exotics to auto reload it for you when it's not equipped. Regardless, Anarchy is by far better than Witherhoard, but for Witherhoard being a special weapon, it's also definitely up there with being a good exotic in terms of performance for PvE content. In Season 14, both Anarchy and Witherhoard were used a lot due to the Breach and Clear mod, which made them both really good in all types of PvE content. Now the only reason I'm not comparing Witherhoard to things like the Colony is simply because the Colony is just not worth using in PvE. Sure, each exotic is unique to its own sort of thing, but the Colony in my opinion is just not for PvE if you're looking for a weapon to deal good damage, whether that's passive DPS or just DPS in general as your main weapon. Witherhoard or Anarchy are your go-to grenade launchers for PvE, whereas the Colony would actually be decent in PvP with its grenades that chase the enemy, almost guaranteeing you a kill. So each exotic has a strength and weakness. Now what are the pros and cons for using Witherhoard? For the pros, it's definitely one of the best special weapons to use in endgame content, as it's good for dealing passive DPS like Anarchy to bosses and champions while you're using other weapons. It also comes with a lot of ammo, and getting ammo is fairly easy when using grenade launcher ammo finder mods. It pairs really well with special finisher if you don't plan on using your super, and it's also good for close range combat in PvE. Additionally, it's one of the best weapons for controlling areas of PvP, and I'd recommend using this weapon in all types of PvE content solo or in endgame activities where you don't have the current best seasonal meta weapons and mods. One other good thing is that it's in the Kinetic slot, which means in PvE content where you may have match game shields, you can adjust to those requirements easily by using a primary energy weapon. On the downside, it takes your Kinetic slot in PvP, which means you could lose out on using your favourite Kinetic primary weapon. It's also not perfect if you want to melt bosses quickly, but it can provide that passive DPS to take enemies down over time, just not the fastest like using 1000 voices and particle deconstruction. So my rating for Witherhoard is going to be a 10 out of 10. I'm giving it a 10 and basically saying this is one of the best exotics in the game, because put simply, it's one of the most well balanced exotics in my opinion. It's not stupidly OP or broken, and it's also not weak. In other words, it's not 1000 voices on steroids, and it's not the colony being really awful for DPS. But overall, I definitely recommend Witherhoard to all new and returning players to get from the exotic kiosk as soon as you can, as a good starting weapon to use in endgame PvE. But if you're a regular player that has all the best exotics in the game like 1000 voices, and you also have good seasonal mods currently, then I'd probably just stick to using those meta weapons rather than using Witherhoard, as the whole point is to have the best DPS as possible, which Witherhoard will not provide for you. Don't get me wrong, Witherhoard is one of the best special weapons to use in endgame, but use it as an alternative if you don't have other options like 1k currently being the best. Now this is your full Witherhoard review and breakdown in 2022, and is it worth using this year? Next you guys should head on over and take a look at all my other exotic weapon reviews for 2022 down below in the playlist for more, but for now, keep grinding out the game for the upcoming Witch Queen, and I'll see you guys soon for the next video.